Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to our spring Burton Suite charity catch-up. We're really pleased that you've joined us today. Whether you're joining us live or whether you're catching up with the recording a little bit later on, we're really glad you've joined us. My name is Ed Marsh. I'm Head of Charity Development at Burton Suite, and I'm here with my colleague Cecile Gillard, who is Burton Suite Charity's Legal Manager. And we're delighted today to actually have some time together to explore some relevant topics that hopefully will be applicable to all of us and be something we can all really learn about today. And our agenda is on your screens now. It's making charity accountability real. Actually, we're going to be looking as well at some of the new questions on the Charity Commission annual return. Just to say, if you this year decide to complete your Charity Commission annual return on the final day before it needs to be filed, you will regret that decision because all these changes that are made to the annual return. So it's well worth listening to that aspect. We're going to be looking a bit about some of the things we can learn from current areas of concern in the sector, perhaps Charity Commission intervention, reports, investigations that actually we need to really learn lessons on as a sector. And then also we're going to just reflect a little bit on this spring budget 2023 and ask the question, was it good for charities? What is in there that's relevant for charities, and what might we need to be aware of as we take things forward? And then, of course, we'll have our usual opportunity for news and questions as well. But just say we're going to run just a very slightly different timings today. So actually we're going to share content with you. We'll probably end up using the full hour to share content. And at that point at 1 o'clock, feel very free to leave if you've got other things to go on to. But what Cecile and I do is we'll stay on the line to be able to be available to answer any questions that you have afterwards. But feel very free to leave after an hour, but do stay on if you can for those questions. You can use the chat function at any point to ask questions. You can also come on a bit live later on and ask those questions as well. You will have heard a polite lady saying that that this is being recorded today, and that's mainly so that people who are not being able to make it can listen to the recording afterwards, or perhaps you can revisit things that you'd really appreciate hearing again. And what we'll do this afternoon is send out that recording, and we'll send out the slides as well for you to be able to revisit. But no names or faces will appear on that recording. And please do look out for that email, because we will also in that email just give you an opportunity to suggest topics for future events. We read those and we listen to that feedback, and we're really delighted to factor that into future events that we run. So without any further ado, I'm going to ask Cecile to kick us off as we think about making charity accountability real.
Thank you very much, Ed. So good afternoon, everybody. We're starting today's event by exploring charity accountability and thinking really about what factors can make your accountability real. Thank you, Ed. So the Charity Governance Code, you'll remember, provides trustees with some guiding principles to apply in leading their charities. And Principle 7 of that code is the one that really touches on this subject really very substantially. And Principle 7 says that the board, the trustees, lead the organisation in being transparent and accountable. The charity is open in its work unless there is good reason for it not to be. So here really we're focusing on the fact that you should always be open in your work. Exceptions should be rare. The norm is openness. So deliberately not sharing any key information should only really be done where that's really necessary and appropriate, where there's a really good reason. For example, it might be to protect the identities and privacy of vulnerable beneficiaries. Think, for example, of a charity involved in domestic violence work. Clearly, the beneficiaries are at high risk there, and their identity would need to be protected. But the transparency point is the foundation here. We're starting from that point. And this form of openness, this principle of openness, transparency, accountability, is certainly something that the trustee should lead on. But the principle also rightly points out that this applies across the whole of the organisation, is transparency and accountability. So it's relevant to all of us in charities, the senior managers, the staff, the volunteers, It's relevant to how we support you in all of those roles, as well as, of course, to the leadership that the trustees are giving. Thank you, Ed. Next slide. So what sort of things help real accountability and making accountability real? Well, certainly a culture of openness and honesty throughout the organisation will help that. It'll help you be real and meaningful in your accountability. And I think charities need to work at creating that culture and then work at living it out in practice. It doesn't kind of just happen. We need to create it, work on it, to keep it going and to build upon it. And of course, to hand it on to people as they come into our organisation. So they come into that culture, they come into a culture of behaving in that open, honest, transparent way. And this transparency is a key part of how you are open and you are honest, so that people know and they can see what's happening in the charity. And that also, of course, reflects onto an openness in behaviour. We want to get to a point where people are comfortable sharing information and explaining their responsibilities and their actions, and they're comfortable to let other people do that too. It'll also help our accountability to be real when we have honest conversations. And those need to take place, I think, about the more difficult areas in our charity, as well as the positive good news stories. So being honest with each other about things that are limiting our effectiveness. What are the external factors that are damaging our work and giving our beneficiaries worse problems? What are those? Let's share them. Let's be open and honest about them. And building on that, I think we need to be honest about which key factors we, the charity, can control, which ones we can address, and which ones are outside of our ability to influence, highlighting them as impacting importantly on what we're doing and the people we're helping and the problems they have, but being crystal clear that, you know, some of these factors won't be ours that we're able to address. And real accountability is also certainly helped by providing understandable and relevant information, both externally and internally, and to give reasons, the reasons that explain the information and the actions. So why did we choose this course of action? Why can't we only use these particular resources and assets in this way? So an openness about the reasons why things are as they are. So what would hinder us taking those kind of approaches? Well, I think factors that can hinder real accountability are particularly, not only these things, but these things: defensiveness, fear, and forgetting your focus, forgetting the charity's focus, particularly in relation to its objects, the charitable purposes, and what outcomes we ought to be seeking to achieve as we pursue our purposes. Forgetting that focus can inhibit us from doing the positive things I've suggested will help our accountability. So if we drift away from our charitable purpose into other areas that are outside our purpose, if we lose focus on the needs of current and future beneficiaries, if we forget that the charity's strategic plan and the key aims of that are there to pursue the purpose and deliver on the charitable objects, produce charitable outcomes, we need to be sure that what we're doing here is focusing on the cause of beneficiaries' needs and the means by which we can relieve those needs and solve the issues they face, or where it's appropriate, where someone else needs to be doing that. And therefore, we shouldn't be focusing too much time and effort on that. We might just highlight it and move on to what we can do. Sometimes the focus is moved too far into certain concerns, reaching our fundraising targets, growing the variety or scale of our activities, so we lose a good balance of perspectives. And losing the right focus can also happen because our internal focus becomes too much on ourselves, wanting the organisation, for example, to retain all our existing staff posts, keeping or indeed increasing our number of locations or our activities, their volume, their range. We're actually not here to ensure organisational survival, and we're not actually here to make our organisation a success. We're here to meet the needs and achieve charitable outcomes for the beneficiaries through the purpose that we have, that fundamental charitable purpose, those objects. The defensiveness hindering us, well, people being anxious to avoid a sense of failure, people being anxious about perhaps potential criticism of the performance of themselves, others, or indeed the performance of the organisation. So they don't share things that would actually help with transparency. And related to that, the fear factor, being fearful that you won't reach targets and key performance indicators, for instance, fundraising targets, or fear that if people understand what funds you have, they won't give you a further grant or make any further donations. Those fear factors can hinder our transparency and accountability. Thank you, Ed. So why does real accountability matter? Well, public trust, of course, is a critical factor. Trust that the charity is delivering real public benefit that's appropriate to its purposes, because that strengthens the charity's reputation and it improves the likelihood people will support the charity. People do trust what they can see and understand. So you earn legitimacy by providing people with clear, trustworthy and understandable information. Which charity is this? What are its charitable purposes? Why does its work matter to the people that it helps and matter to the wider public? What difference is this charity making to the relevant issues? And what are your difficulties in carrying out that work, finding enough income, getting the right volunteers, finding new trustees? What are those external pressures that are impacting? And giving those honest explanations, the genuine answers to the why questions, that will foster trust and support. So, for example, a charity announces it's in financial difficulty because it has insufficient income, and it says it's going to have to reduce some activities and cease other activities. So there's a live press interview with the charity's fundraising manager, and that person is asked, so why have you found it difficult to raise funds? But they don't give an answer. They simply say, we've been working hard to raise funds. They then restate this risk of cuts to activities, and they then plead for donations to be made. There was no transparency in the answer to why has it become hard for you to get the income you need. Good public reporting, of course, in your trustees' annual report and the annual accounts, that's important, but real accountability is about much more than that. So I'd suggest we need to think broadly about how we foster internal accountability, how we foster accountable governance, and how we deal honestly with external relationships, internal and external communications. It's worth putting the time and effort into deciding how do we make these real in our situation and then determining what action we can take to do that. Thank you, Ed. Governance accountability really helps all of this. It begins with good transparency about who your trustees are and how they're appointed. And always, I think, it helps to be open in explaining how you identify new trustees. Where do you go to look for candidates? How do you try to encourage the right balance of skills, experience, and competencies on your board? And also, moving on from who's on the board, let's have some transparency about the decision-making process, so people understand the structure for that. The major decisions at strategic and policy level being taken by our trustees, and how those decisions are taken, what evidence and factors are used to reach the conclusions. What's the intended effect and outcome of a decision? The all-important why question. Think too about how your board communicates its decisions and why they were taken. Keep relating all of that to the charitable purposes and the intended charitable outcomes. And communicating internally with your staff, your volunteers, that's one dimension certainly, but also how do your trustees offer something in the public realm and to key stakeholders like beneficiaries, donors, supporters and volunteers? Could there be some more headlines about board decisions in things like newsletters, updates on your website? Could you publish a very short summary of some key matters after each board meeting? some charities go as far as publishing their board meeting minutes in a public setting with appropriate editing of that which really is sensitive material that's not appropriate for public availability. And think about how the board tells the story well about the charity. Yes, the statutory reporting, but also this optional forms of reporting and communications. And this effort around governance accountability is worthwhile, because good governance accountability engenders confidence in the charity's governance process. Ed, could you move us along? So other forms of internal accountability, thinking about how your board oversees the staff, thinking about the communications and the reporting of the staff to the board, as well as the board to the staff. Thinking about the honesty and the openness in the internal accountability. Is there this culture where people are happy to be accountable, to speak up, to air concerns, to face the difficulties? And yes, procedures and records do have their place. And don't ever overlook the need to address the sensitive areas. Safeguarding, keeping people safe is certainly one of them. The making of the serious incident reports to the Charity Commission when circumstances are right to do that. That's part actually of being transparent. You wouldn't reveal the detail of those reports in a public domain, but making them to the regulator and possibly sometimes being able to say that you've done so after the event in a public setting can be important. So let's move on. Thank you, Ed. For your charity's transparency, I do suggest that it's important to avoid the spin temptation. Take credit and responsibility for what is yours, but really be honest and open about what is yours and what is not yours. So if we can move along to a few examples. So this first charity, on its website, it says that it's part of a family of organisations in 27 countries and that poverty relief programmes are delivered to thousands of families each year. But actually, ABC UK Charity is a funding charity. It raises funds, which it then grants to these family of organisations, but they are all independent organisations with their own purposes, their own governance. And it's those organisations that do the poverty relief work. So what ABC is doing, yes, it's providing fuel, but it's not delivering those programmes. It's not operating in those countries. It's sending funding to organisations in them, but it's not actually directly helping the families in terms of the activities, the anti-poverty activities. So that's not actually as transparent as it ought to be. And the second one, it said in a letter to the parents, from this September, we're going to pay a scholarship of 6% of every child's school fees, and that'll result in every child having a 30% reduction in their annual fees. But what is not clear from that is that this other 24% that gives the total 30% reduction is not provided by XYZ. It's provided by the school's own bursary fund and some other charitable trusts that are completely independent of XYZ. So it's great that XYZ is going to be able to commit 6% of every child's costs each year. And that's something to be proud of, to trumpet, to explain what a difference that's making. But overall, what we've got here is a misleading picture, either by accident or design. Whereas if we look at the next one, really clear factual information here. This is explaining that this organisation is in relationship with other organisations, but it's clear about this organisation being an independent organisation operating in one particular geographic area. It's also clear that although it may refer to the collective overall membership of all these organisations, it's crystal clear about what its membership is. So there's no exaggeration, accidental, no misinterpretation likely to be made here. Likewise, the expenditure, it's quite clear what the expenditure is of this charity from this charity's funds. And then in this example, say it's a website example, you can drill down to find out more about the organisation's activities as opposed to the activities of the total movement across the country. So that, I think, is better example of transparency. So, making accountability real, we need to be honest and brave in telling people about our performance, what went well, what was not so good. We need to be brave in explaining why things are as they are. And the more that this accountability is real, then the more there'll be appreciation of your work and its impact. And that appreciation will extend amongst a wider range of people and organisations. It'll create the right ethics, values and cultures in your charity. It'll help to do that anyway. And all those ethics and values and culture will guide your dealings with everybody who's got an interest in the charity and everyone the charity can potentially have a positive impact on. People will see that you're taking your responsibilities seriously. Public trust and confidence will be strengthened, and people regard the charity as a legitimate voice in its field, an organisation that can credibly speak up for its beneficiaries, explain the issues they face, and offer solutions to those issues. And we would like to support you in this. So if we just move ourselves on, we want to help you make your accountability real. Please come and have the conversation around where you are, what your needs are, how we might do that. We'll be happy to support you in internal and external aspects of governance and related communications, making sure you're governing in compliance with your constitution, understanding the roles, duties, responsibilities of your trustees, that honest communication, that effective communication, and that telling of your story well. So we benefit from making accountability real, and the people we serve benefit. Hope that's really helpful. Ed's going to take us on now to chat about the Charity Annual Return.
Thanks so much, Cecile. The Charity Commission Annual Return, it's all changed for 2023. And I think the headline is this: get ready. You'll be glad that you did, because there is some extra work and extra preparation and awareness needed as we think about annual returns. If you're a charity registered in England and Wales, the annual return is the key way in which the regulator gathers information about charities. It's the most important way. Actually, it's more important than the statutory accounts. It's more important than what you write in your trustees report, because actually this is quite often what forms the data that the Charity Commission holds on the sector. It's often the first information that members of the public see when they search for your charity on the register as well. When they look at the page and there's all kinds of up-to-date data about finances and about who the trustees are, that's all driven from the annual return process. So actually the annual return is a very, very important document. The annual return must be completed by all England and Wales registered charities where they have income of over £10,000 a year. Or actually, if you are a charitable incorporated organisation, you always need to prepare an annual return regardless of your income. And also this is regardless of, actually not all charities with income of 10,000 have to file their accounts with the Commission at the moment. But actually, if your income is over £10,000, you will need to complete an annual return. So this is relevant to, I would suggest, the vast majority of us on the call. And there are new questions for the period 2023 to 25. And there was a consultation late last year on what the new questions could be and should be. And I guess I want to say to you that there's bad news and there's good news. That the bad news is it's more onerous. There's more to do. There's more information to gather. It's a little bit more difficult than it was. The good news is this: it's all an awful lot better than it could have been. The consultation kind of brought all kinds of wide sweeping things proposed in there that thankfully the consultation was able to kind of review. So actually what we ended up with was 6 fewer questions than the consultation was after. But what we still have is that every single charity who completes an annual return, regardless of size, has at least 26 questions to complete. Actually, that could be up to 49 questions, depending on the nature and the scale and the size of the charity. No, there are more questions than previously, and I guess, you know, for us the question is why? Why is that the case? I mean, is it just the kind of the ever increasing kind of creep of regulatory kind of oversight? Everything just gets more complicated all the time. Is it that? Well, to a certain extent, it is that. But actually, what we need to recognise is that increasingly the Charity Commission have a digitally driven agenda. They're really keen to be able to gather more and more information about charity to see a digitisation of services. In fact, just recently, I was talking to the Commission about they're wanting to digitise charity accounts and to make sure that actually when charity accounts are filed, that there's information that can be automatically extracted from those accounts to be able to be used by the regulator. Some real challenges in there, but that's really what's behind this, is actually how do we in an efficient way gather more data about the sector and the charities to whom we regulate as a Commission. These new questions apply to all charities filling in an annual return for their financial year ending on or after 1st of January 2023. So unless you're a December year end and earlier and you're thinking about this now, this doesn't quite yet apply to you, but it will apply, of course, very soon. And there is hopefully a new question guide. So a guide that talks a little bit about, you know, what the new questions are, you know, why they're there, but also gives you a bit of guidance in terms of how you answer those questions. And we'll link to that in our post-event mailing today. But again, that's a very helpful source of information for you to look at. What we're going to do is we're going to think about today what some of those new questions are. Now, all charities who complete an annual return have to answer questions under these 9 categories: income, expenditure, activities outside of the UK, trading subsidiaries where that's relevant, charity addresses and property, structure and membership, employees and volunteers, governance, including a whole raft of kind of mention of policies there, safeguarding and risk. And what I'm going to do now on the following slides is just whiz through these headings and let you know some of the new questions that are happening and just seek to unpack and explain those a little bit to give you a bit of a heads up. Many of them are relevant to all, some of them are relevant only to the largest. So firstly, under income, actually, if your income as a charity is less than £500,000 a year, you will need to put some numbers into your annual return, not only your total income and expenditure like you've always had to do, but actually also you will need to find the value of donations and legacies, the value of income from charitable activities, from other trading activities and from investment. And those, of course, are pulled from your annual accounts. If you've got properly prepared sort annual accounts, then you'll be able to pull those numbers from there. The reason why it applies to less than £500,000 is actually you'll be aware if you're a charity that's larger than that, you already have to insert a whole raft of financial information in your annual return. And so actually that information is driven from there instead. But be ready for that. And if you need some help with understanding that and being able to read your accounts to be able to bring that, then we'd be delighted to help. And obviously, I mean, I think what's behind this question is the Charity Commission seeking to gather information about the levels of dependence on particular income streams. You know, do we have a whole swathe of charities on the register who are over-dependent on a single funding stream? And we need to be aware that that's a risk to the sector. But also, if you are a charity with income of greater than £100,000 a year, then you also need to answer this question. You need to give the value of the single highest donation from a corporate donor, if that's relevant, an individual, and then a related party. A related party has a complicated definition, but essentially it's someone closely connected by family relationship or business relationship to a trustee. And so you need to identify what was the highest value donation you received and disclose the value of that donation, not the name of who it was or anything like that, but the value of that donation. To be clear, you know, if you have one person who gives you £1,000 a month for a year, and you have another person who gives you a one-off donation of £6,000, it's the £6,000 that goes in the annual return. But clearly this, you need to be able to have a way of knowing what the answer to that question is and to be able to provide that information. And then there's expenditure. If grant making is the main way in which your charity carries out its purposes, then you need to include the value of grants that were made to individuals, to other charities, and then here's the crunch one, non-charitable organisations. And actually this is going to be, I guess, from the Charity Commission's point of view, a real test as to who's read the guidance on working with non-charitable organisations. but you're also required to say, were any of our grant recipients related parties? Actually, that's not a disclosure that's required in the accounts. And so actually you do need to be aware where you are giving to related parties. You need to include the value of those grants there. Moving on, activities outside the UK. Now, this is a big one. If you have activities outside of the UK, actually there is a question for you to answer, regardless of your size. Is do you have formal written agreements in place with any partners delivering charitable activities on its behalf outside the UK? And that includes grant recipients. Actually, if you look at the guidance, the interpretation of the formal written agreements is effectively a legally enforceable agreement. Now, actually, it's not saying that's a requirement. It's not saying that's a legal requirement, but it's asking you to say whether you do have those in place or not. And clearly, for any charity, it's going to be a risk-based approach as to the extent to which those agreements are in place. But if you're a charity with significant overseas activities and you don't have formal written agreements in place, and you won't be able to tick that question, and that potentially is leaving yourself open to a little bit of a question mark there. So so please do consider that. And if a formal written agreement is a step too far, consider actually what agreements are there in place, what kind of understandings are in place, and how can we formalize those to a greater degree. We need to talk about as well how much money is transferred outside of the UK using a method other than a regulated banking system. And hopefully that's reasonably obvious as to why that's the case, is just to really get a feel for the risks and the potential of money laundering around there. Now, here's a relatively innocuous one: addresses and property. There's some good news here in that the Commission have backed off from their original proposal of asking charities to give the addresses and postcodes of all properties from which they conduct any charitable activity. That would have been quite an interesting exercise for many charities to be able to provide that information. Thankfully, they've backed off from that requirement. They've also backed off from the requirement of needing to disclose the country in which your website is hosted. Thankfully, that is not part of the final annual return questions, because that's a very, very difficult question to answer for many charities. But you are required to confirm the public address on the register. Is it correct? And then is there another address from which the administrative headquarters are based for the charity, and to make sure you disclose that address as well. So that's a step further than it was before, just a positive confirmation of those details. Other than the trustees, does your charity have members who are entitled to vote under the charity's governing document? If you don't understand what that means and you would appreciate help understanding that in the context of your charity, we would love to help you understand that. You need to also give more information about employees and volunteers, and you're required to say at the end of the financial year, what were the numbers of employees permanently employed on fixed-term contracts, and then the number of workers that were self-employed, to provide those numbers, to provide the numbers working outside of the UK for your charity as well. And then also to include the total amount that's spent on the employee payroll. Now, those first two bullet points, you think to yourself, oh, well, that's easy. Actually, in your accounts, you need to provide the average numbers. This is the number at the year end. So this is different information. So you need to make sure that you're up to speed with understanding what information you need to gather there. And then here's some fun. In the governance section, there's a revised list of asking you to confirm what policies and procedures you had in place at the end of the financial year. And I've given the complete list here. Now, the ones that are starred are the ones that the new ones on the list. So that includes a serious incident reporting policy and procedures. It includes a trustee expenses policy. It includes policies around campaigns and political activity, bullying and harassment, social media, and engaging external speakers at charity events. So these are new policies that it's asking you to confirm whether you have in place. But let's be clear, not all of these policies are required by law. Now, many of them are best practice. In fact, the Charity Commission, the ones that I put a hash by there, they're the ones the Charity Commission said we would expect most charities to have policies in this area, but it will depend on the particular type of charity in question. But if you are used to completing the Charity Commission annual return, you'll probably notice that a few have fallen off the list as well. So there's no longer any reference to, do you have a grant making policy? There's no reference to policies around paying staff or volunteer management. I don't know why. Presumably they just felt the list was getting far too long and they've prioritised these instead. But do have a little think about these areas. It's not necessarily a bad thing to not tick that you haven't got a policy if you feel a policy is not appropriate. But just do bear in mind that the policies you have in place will be listed on your Charity Commission entry on the Charity Commission register, and any kind of glaring omissions there would be noticed by people. And then safeguarding and risk. There's an explicit question to ask: has your charity provided services to children and or adults at risk during the financial year? And then a much more complicated question, although probably slightly clearer in what it's asking, about obtaining the required level of DBS checks. And I mean, it requires two particular things. It requires a real understanding of what you're doing around DBS checking and understanding what the terms mean. So make sure you get on top of that. But also, I know for me, if I sit here as I'm chair of trustees of a particular charity, I'm not sure off the top of my head, I know I could confirm that oh yes, I'm absolutely convinced that yes. I would have to go and ask someone. I would need to review the data. I'd need to find out whether I can tick yes to these particular answers. And this is why I don't leave the annual return to the last day. Make sure you prepare ahead in advance. Make sure you are able to gather the information and the answers you need to be able to truthfully tick these answers. And then finally, there's a kind of a secret question, not a secret question, but a kind of a special question that the Commission are reserving the right to put in over these next 3 years. And they will potentially ask you about some specified external event that's affecting the whole world, and did it have an impact on your charity during the year? You know, for example, that might be the COVID pandemic, it might be the cost of living crisis, it might be the war in Ukraine. And actually it reserves the right to ask, actually, in these 12 different areas of operation, and there's a whole defined list, did it have a positive impact or a negative impact on those areas? So again, just watch out for that one. It's quite a long question, but it's they're gathering information about the impact on the sector. And so, just as I close this section, what are some of the critical success factors to avoid you looking a little bit like this lady in this picture here, where you're tearing your hair out because, oh my goodness me, it's the last day before I have to submit the annual return 10 months after my year end, and I've left it till now. Actually, what are the critical success factors? Be prepared. Start really early. So much of the information for the annual return can be gathered at any point, really, but it can be gathered as soon as your financial year end is finished. So consider preparing yourself for the requirements and gathering the information early. I think a team approach, more than ever before, is what's going to result in a successful annual return being filed. It's going to recognise that you're not going to know all the answers, but you need to work with colleagues, whether they're volunteers or staff or others, to be able to gather the information that's necessary. And then finally, and we've said this before, but I would say, if you're a trustee on the line here, make sure you approve the Charity Commission annual return. You're aware of what it says before it is submitted. Don't just assume it's an administrative function that your treasurer or secretary will deal with, and it's not something to worry about. In many cases, this is a more in the spotlight return than your accounts are in the present environment. You know, whether that's fair or not, I'm not really sure, but it's just a fact of life at the moment. I mean, it's interesting with this digitization kind of process. I think there's lots of strengths of it. Of course, it's a great thing to be able to gather information about charities, but you know, something we say all the time at Burton Sweet is that your annual accounts play a really key role in telling the story really well, and you can't tell the story with a digital tick box yes and no very easily. And so our hope is that over time, there will be ways in which that story can be clearer and better told and available to the Commission, and not just a tick box yes and no and data driven agenda that they have at the moment. Of course, that's not easy. But do get in touch with us if we can help in any ways. Actually, when it comes to thinking about policies, you know, we have a lot of kind of wisdom to be able to bring to that, to be able to review draft policies you have, or to give you kind of recommendations of what those policies should include, and whether it's around reserves, risk management, internal controls, conflicts of interest. And actually, if you want great quality accounts to be prepared, because you know that you're going to need to pull some of that information into your annual return, we prepare great charity accounts on a bespoke basis. We don't treat charities like widgets, we treat them like individual charities. Everyone's got their own story to tell, and we would love to help you with that story. And then if you need to just understand a bit more about your charity, do we have a membership? What is that membership? Is that membership wider than our trustees? Do we really understand that to be able to answer this question? Then do get in touch. We would love to help inform you. Cecile.
Thank you, Ed. So we're going to move on now. Ed will shift us on the slides to think about key learnings in current areas of concern about charities. And I think I've highlighted these areas: governance failures, certainly, because they lead to poor decisions, because they lead to weak leadership, sometimes inadequate actions or slowness to address issues, which then leads to higher risk and greater likelihood of failure or harm arising. Charity Commission concerns here include whether trustees have complied with and fulfilled their duties and responsibilities as trustees under charity law, and in particular whether they're exercising sufficient oversight over the charity's activities, its resources, and indeed its executive leadership. Failing to comply with the charity's constitution is also a problem. Might relate to straying outside the objects and powers, but it's often about failure to follow required procedures. For example, how trustees are appointed, what terms of office they should be serving in a limited term of office or a retirement by rotation regime. And also failures around the constitution and observing it can often be about failing to take trustees' decisions properly, or indeed allowing other people to usurp the board's role and make decisions or take actions that those people really don't have proper authority to do. So those are aspects around the constitution. Financial areas of concern, well, trustees not always spotting the right signs of financial distress in their charities, not taking sufficient action promptly to address financial distress, sometimes at the extreme end of the scale, failing to see risks to overall viability, either of particular activities or even to the charity as a whole, possible failure of the charity completely. And then risks around funding sources, for example, not addressing increasing vulnerability to reduction or ending of some key funding. But there have also been some cases where the funding sources for charities have caused issues because of the nature of the source. So there is an example where one of the areas where the Commission had to engage with a charity, it was very reliant on donations from the charitable trust of a high-risk financial business. And that financial business collapsed, and that caused immediately financial pressures because a large proportion of the charity's income was coming from that source and it dried up. But also there was some really damaging publicity because the charity was publicly associated with this as one of its major funding sources. And the collapse of this business, though nothing to do with the charity in the sense that it wasn't the charity's fault, but the bad kudos, as it were, rather than good kudos, rubbed off on the charity. And there were some issues arising from that. Around keeping people safe, well, the continuing fallout from current and past safeguarding failures with major charities and institutions, including, but not limited to, faith-based ones and international organisations, but also concerns now around smaller local charities having safeguarding failings, and where the issues, well, not taking concerns seriously, failing to record and address suspected abuse, systemic failures around not treating keeping people safe as a constant and major priority, lack of proper oversight by trustees, also highlighted as a weakness, along with failures in internal and external reporting. And on the inadequate oversight of the executive staff as a further area of general concern, the failure to address potential wrongdoing or abuse by staff in various areas, and that's certainly including financial misbehaviour, and it's sometimes, of course, including safeguarding. In one particular case where concerns arose about a senior employee, that the Charity Commission tried to engage with the charity and its trustees, but repeatedly met a silence, no information given, no cooperation provided by the trustees. The trustees let this individual carry on in the role. They didn't, for example, suspend them, pending the investigation and the outcomes, which would have been in the individual's interest as well as the charities to protect them in a a personal high risk situation. And there were multiple instances, sadly, of the charity simply not complying with a formal obligation during the investigation, including the Commission issued a formal order requiring documents and information to be handed over, which simply was not met. So how do we get the firm foundations, thank you, Ed, for addressing these kind of areas? Well, the board needs to focus on its core role. Strategy, performance and assurance. Those are the bedrocks of the core role of the trustees. And of course, coming back always to that charitable purpose being why we exist. So thank you, Ed. Where should trustees be focusing? Clearly, strategy and strategic objectives, setting them, reviewing them. Clearly, the policy framework for the charity's activities. They should, of course, be paying attention to effectiveness and impact, public benefit results, charitable outcomes, that monitoring, yes, safeguarding, yes, financial, but yes, other, proper use of the charitable resources, that restricted funds are only used for their restricted purposes. Same, of course, with the restricted assets that you buy with these funds, including staff roles and physical assets. We need to make sure there's good reporting to the board, internal accountability and staff oversight. That's particularly focused around the chief executive and the senior management team, but total internal accountability and oversight of all the staff. And risk, trustees, of course, always have ultimate responsibility for risk. Now, much practical risk management will be delegated to others, but they've got to take responsibility for that overall focus on risk and its management. And it's really important too that they're paying attention to the external accountability and all the legal compliance aspects of the charity. Thank you, Ed. And then I think thinking about how to address these areas of concern through trustee decisions and actions, we really need our board to be making decisions and then taking actions and seeing to it that all that's done in a timely way. We need to make sure the decisions and the actions are appropriate to the circumstances, the challenges, the risks. We really, really do need to make them clear, and we need to document them. If an issue arises, how can we evidence what we did and why that was justified? And to make sure that both the decision-making and the actions in consequence are carried through, and do make sure that this whole business around keeping the good records of it all is carried through. Thank you, Ed. Then I think also we need to think about the interactions with our regulators. I mean, particularly this is the Charity Commission, but for some of us, it'll be other regulators. Some faith-based charities have other regulators. Some care charities certainly do. A number of us have to worry about more than one regulator. In terms of the Charity Commission, please respond to them. If they express some anxieties about the charity, if they ask for information, you need to get on with that as a priority. You need to be honest and open with regulators. Please do realise that that's the best way of handling any inquiries and concerns that they raise with you. Often being honest and open will simply resolve the issue. They'll be fine after that. And then the serious incident reporting, do treat that as something that you really must prioritise. Thanks, Ed. Other learnings, well, keeping that evidence and having that information, certainly watching for warning signs and acting upon them. That culture of welcoming positive challenge at all levels in the charity. Knowing what your operating environment is, that's really important because that's impacting on all of us, and getting help and support from your advisors, which then brings me on to ways in which we can support you. Thank you, Ed. So again, we're here to help you on all of this. Please come and have the conversation around the governance issues that you're facing, the challenges, around your constitution, understanding it and following it, trustee decision making and how you get that right. Addressing areas where you've got particular concerns, making sure you're interacting well with the Commission and your other regulators. And yes, of course, that whole public accountability, including the public accounting and reporting and the independent scrutiny, of course, of your accounts as well. All of these areas and more, we're very happy to support you in. So please come and seek the help that you need. So thanks. Let's have a look now with Ed about some news from the budget.
Thank you, Cecile. Just spend a few minutes reflecting on things in the budget that are very relevant to charities. Won't be able to cover everything here, but just perhaps important to look at some of the key things. I think it's fair to say, and I hope you don't mind me expressing an opinion, but I'm not sure that I expected the budget to be that helpful for charities. I think I expected charities to be largely ignored, as they kind of seem to have been for the last few years. And so actually, I think that for many people, the budget was a bit better than expected for charities. And in particular, it was so helpful to get a shout out from the Chancellor. The Chancellor talked about the brilliant work that charities are doing to help people struggling in tough times. It talked about the fact that the sector is able to reach people that government simply can't reach. It sounds like a commercial for a refreshment, some description, doesn't it? But I think it is certainly pleasing to have had that kind of recognition of the value and the importance of the charity sector in difficult times. And it was also great to see that in England there was a release of £100 million over the next 2 years for charities and voluntary organisations, particularly to support those working with vulnerable people and support those with providing emergency support with accommodation, food and warmth, but also to fund measures to increase energy efficiency and sustainability as well. And that's been greeted quite warmly. Obviously, the detail is yet to be worked out. It will also affect many charities where there's additional funds made available for leisure facilities like pools, swimming pools, to be able to be more energy efficient. There's £10 million that was kind of awarded for suicide prevention charities and organisations in recognising their vital work. There's a continued higher rate of tax relief for theatres, orchestras and museums and galleries. There was a confirmation that, actually until now, charity tax relief, a charity could apply for charity tax relief if they were a charity based in the EU, and actually, the EEA. And now actually it's been confirmed that that will be restricted just to UK charities. So that's only available to UK charities with a little bit of a transition period. There's a call for evidence around providing VAT relief on energy saving materials, and that to include all kinds of buildings, but particularly charitable buildings used for a sole charitable purpose. And that might be of real help to charities that are seeking to make their buildings more energy efficient. Of course, also in the budget was a rather more optimistic view of where inflation is going to be by the end of the year, and of course that will make a big difference to the charity sector. You know, there's so many charities that are telling a story that actually they're needing to meet gaps in funding from reserves, because actually the contracts they negotiated a year or so ago are just kind of nowhere near worth what they were. And of course then the extension of the energy price guarantee is good for consumers. It's good for people that charities are seeking to help. I think in terms of kind of knowing help for the sector, I think there's still a desire for there to be more help for the sector in terms of energy costs. There's more to say, there's more things that happened in the budget than that, but those are, I guess, the key headlines. I mean, not strictly related to this budget, but I think it's just a point worth drawing out, really, is that actually it was announced a while ago that the income tax thresholds would be frozen, and so actually the personal allowance, the 20% ban, the 40 and 45% rates of tax, those bans have been frozen till April 2028. And if you're someone who ever thinks about these things very much, actually what you'll realise is this effectively a rise in tax. It is actually, as inflation is present, as wages hopefully go up, actually if those thresholds are frozen, then effectively that means that there will be more people who will become taxpayers than before. There'll be more people who end up in the higher 40% or 45% tax brackets. And what does it mean when there are more taxpayers? Well, if you're a charity that relies on gift aid, if you're a charity that relies on significant public donations, then actually it's likely to be that people who weren't previously taxpayers and so hadn't filled in a gift aid declaration, this might be the time to be getting your messaging clear about the fact that if you are someone who becomes a taxpayer, then this is the difference that filling in a gift aid declaration could make to this charity. The evidence is that very few people in the higher rates of tax claim the extra relief that they're eligible to claim on their tax return. And so this is a great chance to talk to them about that. Also, of course, inheritance tax, there's a freeze in the nil rate band. That means that more estates will be paying inheritance tax. It means that more people will be looking to relieve tax, and that might mean that people will give more to charity in their wills. And so think about talking to your donors about legacy giving. 2028 is a long time away, and it's time for us to make sure that we're maximising the impact of, what is for many, of course, a very tricky situation for people who genuinely want to give to charity. Let's be making sure we're providing some education about how they can maximise the benefit of that. Just a quick couple of items of news, and then we'll take some questions.
Thank you, Ed. So just two things really I wanted to mention on news. That the Charities Aid Foundation has recently done some surveying of charity resilience in the context of the cost of living crisis particularly. And over 4 months, they looked on 3 key dimensions: income stability, demand for services, and operating costs. And headlines wise, they found that 57% of charities examined have seen an increase in demand for their services year on year compared to the same time last year. Only half of those that were surveyed were confident they have sufficient funds to meet current demand. And 31%, only 31%, had high confidence in retaining their current funding levels. 50% of the charities reported they're using reserves to cover operational costs, and more than half of the charities across the UK that are part of this survey are worried about their ability to survive. Particular critical issues really for charities providing care and support services, for example, to children, people with disabilities, older people. They're the most concerned generally. And the overall conclusion seemed to be that there are real signs of vulnerability as the sector faces into this cost of living crisis. We will send you a link to the report in the mailing after the event. Actions to take to address the issues, well, I'd say engage with donors and funders. See if you can get some resilience funding from them, for example, multi-year funding rather than annual, more funding perhaps for increasing core costs, perhaps some special funding to help you through this difficult period. Increase your efforts, of course, around financial planning and monitoring, and prioritise resilience building, and obviously make good use of charity sector resources and support from people like us, our advice and services. Second area to quickly mention, there's been some concerns about a blog by the Charity Commission's new chair, urging charities to, quote, model a better kind of discourse. He particularly commented around the dialogue about the migration crisis. But as we're approaching a local elections across most of England and Wales, just a reminder that, of course, you can engage with activities that highlight your cause and factors that are impacting on your beneficiaries and their needs and the solutions to the needs, in terms of speaking out about that during an election period. But you need to keep focused on your charitable purposes as you do that, and be mindful of the Charity Commission's guidance on campaigning and political activity. It is clear from that you can engage in these areas. It's a legitimate way to champion your purposes and contribute to carrying out your charitable activities, but done on a sound evidence and reasoned discussion basis. And of course, being careful to avoid any suggestion of party political bias, pro or con. I think I want to encourage you not to be scared. If it's relevant to your mission to engage, and you would engage and your trustees believe it's the right thing to do, then engage, but engage in the right ways. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you, Cecile. As we said at the start of the event, we fully intended today to take up a full hour with content and to be able to kind of share news and share content with you today. And so it might very well be that you need to go off and have your lunch, or you've got something else on now, and please feel very free to leave if you'd like to. But Cecile and I are going to stay on for another sort of 10 minutes or so, just to be able to take a chance to answer any questions that you have. And we've had some questions come in, so great to see if you do need to leave now. We will record these questions, so you can catch up with them afterwards. But we've had a few questions. I'll just read some out. We had questions around what we said about what you need to write in the Charity Commission annual return about employees and employee numbers. And the question is, did you say headcount and FTE is at the year end or the average for the year? Average wages can only be calculated by dividing total payroll by average FTE. So yeah, just to clarify, the disclosure in the accounts is to provide average headcount. So that's the requirement. Many people also include average FTE, full-time equivalent, because obviously part-time working in the sector is widespread, and it's a much more helpful figure, I would suggest, FTE, but the requirement is average headcount in the accounts. In the Charity Commission annual return, it is headcount at the year end. So headcount at the year end, so at the last day of the financial year, those numbers. And of course, they might be slightly different from the average that's in your accounts. And then also, thank you, can the Treasurer complete the return and save it, but not submit, so that they can print off a copy for the trustees to approve before it's actually submitted? Yes, that is possible. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky figuring out how to, but it is possible. I'm part of a board where we do that, where there's a draft filled out and then it's circulated for others to comment on before the final submit button actually goes in. Again, that's a reason to prepare a draft early. Great. So let's just go on a couple of questions about overseas activities, and particularly some of the definitions there. So what are charitable activities on its behalf? If the charity just gives something to a charity working overseas, is that on the giving charity's behalf? I mean, firstly, just to say, do have a look at the question guide. There's a number of different questions about overseas activities, and sometimes the definitions very slightly change depending on the nuance of the particular question. But I think possibly the question that you're referring to was the one around formal written agreements. And so just to say, I mean, just sort of diving into the guidance on that, actually the guidance does make it clear that charitable activities may include direct service provision. It's something you're doing yourself, or it might include providing funding or grants to partners or third parties to deliver those services. And it gives the example of a charity providing a grant to an overseas charity or NGO for the purposes of building a school in Yemen. So it's clear that when it comes to written agreements, it is referring to, when it talks about delivering charitable activities, that actually it's referring not only to you delivering those yourself directly, but grant funding another organisation to deliver those activities. Do have a little look through the guidance. And again, just to confirm, the Commission are not saying it's a legal requirement to have formal written agreements in place with partners delivering things overseas. They're asking whether you have got them, because it considers it to be good practice, and especially that charities will consider that on a risk basis and make sure that obviously they're being proportionate to the level of activities the charity undertakes. I'm just going to have a little further look down questions here. I have one saying, how can charities help vulnerable people access the grant that I mentioned earlier on? I'm afraid we don't know the answer to that yet. As always, you get the big headlines, you get the big details about funding and grants. I haven't yet seen the mechanisms by which those grants will be made available. So it's a case of keeping a lookout. DCMS have clarified, the fact that actually most of it will be grants in 2023-24. There'll be some grant funding the year after, but just got to keep an eye on Charity Press, keep an eye on kind of your usual sources, and obviously if we see any further detail, we'll highlight that to you as well. We'll just read a question here concerning the new policies. Whilst it would be possible to draft our own policy, there is always the possibility that the way it's drafted is incomplete or simply inadequate, as often the drafter isn't best qualified to draw all the correct threads together. Whilst generic templates may not be possible, is there any guidance which drills down to what headings at least should be covered in each report? Cecile, I just wondered whether you wanted to make comment on this question. Any thoughts? You're on mute, by the way.
Sorry, I think it depends which policy we're talking about. I mean, there are things you'd expect to see in them, but some of the detail does have to be specific to the situation. So I think it's very much a case of trying to get some steer, maybe from people like us, giving you some advice, and then perhaps working on things that are customized to your circumstances, as well as addressing the areas that one would expect to be addressed in that. So I think that's part of how you deal with it. It's a bit of a teamwork effort here, I think.
It's fair to say that the sector in general are very supportive of one another, and quite frequently, I quite frequently get questions about, have you seen helpful policies kind of in practice or whatever? And obviously, where they're ones that are publicly available, they're ones that aren't involved. Sometimes what I do is just there are ways in which there's a sharing of information, but actually you've got to be really clear that it's something that's relevant. And there's nothing worse than a policy that doesn't actually mean anything because it's not what happens in practice. And in many ways, what I'd suggest in terms of a policy is that start simple. Better to have something and to see that develop. But yes, certainly there are all kinds of guidance available. There are various guidance are also available from various agencies around about the place. I know we collaborated on an event recently with Stewardship. Stewardship particularly work with Christian charities and churches, and they have a policy pack that's available for purchase. But also, very many of the kind of national advisory bodies, whether it's NCVO or others, actually have some really great helpful guidance on policies as well.
And just to add to that, Ed, sometimes some charities, of course, are in a scenario with others where they've got sort of regional or central guidance. I mean, some of the faith charities clearly have that guidance and standards on things like safeguarding, for example, which again, that's obviously something as one of your sources to help you put it all together.
Thank you. I have actually removed the mute all kind of button. So if you would actually like to ask a question out loud, feel very free to unmute yourself and ask that question out loud if you'd like to now. I'll keep my eye on the chat as well. But there's a final opportunity to ask any questions.
Mine's not so much a question as a comment, and it's going back to the thing of the issues earlier around sort of decision making. There's nothing like having a discussion and making a decision and then looking back at the minutes a couple of years later to realise that it doesn't ring any bells at all. And it's a plea really about the quality of minute taking. So I know that minutes are so often seen as a chore if you haven't got somebody who is a formal secretary. It does the rounds, and the person has the least resistance ends up taking the minutes. But it's just a plea really that the minutes are extremely important, and it's really helpful to at least record what decision was made and why that decision was made. And so often, as I say, looking back with the best will in the world, it's often not that clear. So, when you sign off, if you're in the position of signing off the minutes, it's worth just having that look with a clear eye and thinking, does this actually tell us what we need to know?
Thank you. That's a very helpful comment indeed. And as we, I expect most of us know, minute taking can be actually a bit of an art, really. You certainly, sometimes it's a little bit over the top when minutes are blow by blow in terms of what everyone said, and trying to capture everything, which is almost impossible most of the time. Sometimes the minutes are so bare, it's like, well, we arrived at this time and the biscuits were nice and then we went home. I think that's a very helpful comment, Kim. Thank you for that.
Could I just add to it, and I certainly support the observation that's been made, and that is helpful. Make sure that as you're drawing up minutes, that the source of any basis for decisions and evidence is clearly recorded in those minutes, and how you can go and find that. So if a report was provided to the board, an electronic link to it or a copy of it, that sort of thing, because otherwise, again, you're left with, well, okay, we can see there was a discussion, we can see they had reasons, but actually there's some key evidence here that's missing as to why they reached this judgment.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to ask a question?
Just come back to the question of a template to do the report that was mentioned earlier on. I think as somebody who runs a very small family trust, this is just an explosion. And unless somebody gives us some guidelines, I think it's going to be very difficult. So any thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I think the first question to bear in mind is actually what policies are relevant for us in our context. And actually in a small a trust that's there to administer family giving, it's not probably going to be as relevant to have all the policies that are stated on. So really, it's taking a step back and saying, well, actually, if we are a trust with 3 voluntary trustees, we don't have any staff. Actually, what for us does a bullying and harassment policy look like? What does a trustee expenses policy, where actually no trustees ever claim any expenses, because we're just all on a voluntary basis, meeting a couple of times a year around the kitchen table. You really do need to consider to yourself, and the Charity Commission don't expect every charity to have every policy, but what they're looking for is a judgment call about what is appropriate to the circumstances of the charity. It would be very odd, and no one would believe you if you ticked every single box, we've got all of those policies, and they saw that on your Charity Commission record. They just wouldn't believe you, would they? Cecile, anything to add there?
No, I think that's really helpful. I mean, reiterating that what's appropriate to you. And again, just a clear record internally, we don't have an expenses policy because none of our trustees claim expenses, full stop. Crystal clear why.
Thank you.
Thank you. And anybody else? Great. Well, thank you so much for staying on with us for an extra few minutes. We're delighted you've been able to join us today. Do look out for an email, which hopefully will come around a bit later on this afternoon. It will contain a copy of the slides, also a copy of this recording as well. We really, really hope that this content has been useful to you today, and we'd love you to keep in touch with us, to engage with us. Feel free to ask us questions after the event as well. And if there's any way we can help you, we would love to help. But meanwhile, have a lovely rest of your day. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you very soon.